Okay, so we're going to start now. Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming. I'm Alexandra Provan, the editor of Triple Canopy. This is Triple Canopy. Hello out there in here. And yeah, thank you for coming to Escape. And the discussion with, so thank you to all of them for coming as well. I will be very brief, and then Elvia is going to provide a more detailed introduction. And I think as far as conversation, and we'll probably finish at 8 or so, depending on how people are feeling, and there will be some time for Q&A at the end. I should also say that we advise you to wear a mask while you're seated, and also please turn off or silence your phones. The bathrooms are there, and if you're leaving early, please take the stairs, which there's a door right next to the elevator. So I'll also say that this event is technically part of an issue of Triple Canopy that is launching in a couple weeks. So it's a launch and a pre-launch. And that issue, our 28th, is focused on questions that are very relevant to this discussion and to Elvia's book about how life is being redefined and re-engineered in light of ecological crisis and the new kinds of cultural narratives that are being formed in response and in an effort to enable us to have a say in what life will look like in the future. I will read very brief bios, and I encourage you to read more about the participants on our website and to also read and watch and otherwise experience their work. Elvia, I imagine most of you know to some extent, is a writer living in New York, and she is the author of the novel Oval and Death by Landscape, which brings us here tonight. And yeah, her work has appeared in the New York Review of Books, The Nation, The Atlantic, and several other wonderful publications. She's also contributing editor at Eflux Journal. Alex Kleeman is the author of multiple amazing novels, including most recently Something New Under the Sun, and You Too Can Have a Body Like Mine, as well as the short story collection Intimations. She's also working on a trilogy that we might discuss briefly, depending on level of comfort and progress in the past 6 months or year. But it sounds very exciting, and I'm excited. I'm looking forward to learning at least a little bit more. Adam Khalil, a member of the Ojibwe tribe, is a filmmaker and artist, and a core contributor to the group The New Red Order, and a co-founder of Cousins Collective. And Bayley Sweitzer is a filmmaker living and working in Brooklyn, and they together made Nosferatu, which we are screening tonight. And I think I'll stop there and give the floor to Elvia. Thanks again for coming, and thank you especially to Elvia for celebrating the book with us tonight.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Triple Canopy, for hosting. Alex has been a really wonderful creative collaborator in figuring out this kind of like weird, awesome event with the ultimate participants, who I'm just really thrilled to have. I'll talk a little bit about, just a very little bit about the book and the event, and then we'll get to the screening. So the event, Escape from Humanity, is a way of expanding on some of the themes of my book. This isn't a traditional book launch or anything. In true Triple Canopy tradition, it's like a way of bringing in people who have informed the work and are doing the kind of work that I talk about in the book. So it's a collection of essays about narratives in fiction, movies, art, and culture at large that decenter the human as the protagonist. Over centuries, a lot of effort has gone into defining and isolating the human as a category of being, differentiated from everything else, plants and animals and microbes and rocks and rivers and machines. In fiction, which is my focus, this means that the human tends to be placed in the foreground, with all those other non-human elements in the background, into a landscape against which the action occurs. going to read some very short paragraphs from the book just so that I'm seen holding it at some point. Seems important. Since at least the Enlightenment, the human has been enshrined as a necessary classification, in that it has supposedly been used to grant equality among humans. Again and again, the category has been updated to be more politically inclusive, as if calling everyone a person is enough to deconstruct hierarchies and systems of oppression. Who or what counts as human has continually shifted to accommodate political aims. When convenient, corporations have been granted elements of personhood in the eyes of the law, affording them rights and freedoms formerly reserved for individuals. On the other side, groups such as the Great Ape Personhood movement advocate extending something like human rights to animals in order to prevent their mistreatment. And a handful of courts around the world have granted geological formations such as bodies of water legal personhood in response to claims that rivers and lakes deserve respect and autonomy, namely from the corporations and governments that seek to destroy them for profit. Claiming personhood is perhaps the most obvious strategy at hand within a humanist system that sees human species as the supreme form of being. Yet the category has always been composed of hierarchies and categories, both internal and external to the concept, which have failed humans and non-humans alike. Present circumstances, the extinction era, require us to relinquish the human's position at the top of the pyramid in the center of the world, the protagonist leading the plotline of history. An ecosystems approach, on the other hand, sees all elements as vital influences, and not because they're as important as people, but because people are interdependent too. After all, it's due to our interdependence that humans, like all other elements of ecosystems, are facing extinction. To propose altering the human role in the story of the world might sound counterintuitive, given that people have fucked up the world so much. But only a perspective shift in terms of figure and ground can adequately portray the ecological dependencies that have led the world to environmental cataclysm. This move could also shift the political responsibility from the generalized human collective onto the few rich people largely culpable for the disaster. Where do I situate myself in this book of essays about the importance of ecosystems beyond the human, in a book about what the world might look like without finite selves at all? I'm here throughout these essays because I'm not nowhere, but my presence is between the trees, at least at first. As this book moves forward, I appear more and more, and what begins as a look outward becomes an interrogation of the writing process and the self. This is a book about becoming what you study, about what it feels like to embed in the landscape. Okay. This is Alexandra's book, which I also want to hold up. So in the book, I look at examples of stories throughout history where people confront and are destabilized or taken over by non-human entities. Maybe they fall in love with non-humans, or they reproduce with non-humans, create art with non-humans, or are in some way invaded, infected, or body snatched. Work like Alexandra's and Adam and Bayley's is exactly the kind of storytelling I write about and I'm excited about, so I'm just happy to be. The title of the event, Escape from Humanity, means a lot of things in relation to these topics. First of all, it means escaping certain humanist ideals that hold us as distinct from other forms of being. Second, it might mean escaping our individual bodies, figuratively in forms of collective practice, or literally by being changed on the cellular level. And actually, we're already kind of escaping what we think of as our human form, whether we like it or not. Our bodies aren't composed of the same matter that they were 1,000 or even 100 years ago. And then there's the fact that from the perspective of other species, the planet would be better off without us. So I'm also thinking about how the world might want to escape from us too. Escape for most of us is a fantasy. We're tangled up. But fantasies are what fiction does best. So that's what I'm hoping to talk about tonight. The work of the three people we've invited has helped me imagine various forms of fugitivity from the human. Alexandra's fiction, especially her new novel, Something New Under the Sun, era, and it also connects directly to an essay in my book about vampires, which we can talk about later. Should we start the screening?
What else can I do for you?
Can you change yourself into an Indian? Or even better, an African.
Is that even possible?
We are aliens here. We can get away with anything. But we can't get away with this. I'm not black. I'm just painted black. To be black, you have to be black. Coming here, we're now 2 races removed from these people. So, if we can't change into one of them, then we'll change one of them into one of us.
But sir, the sun! Hurry!
My name's Christopher Columbus. Welcome to my new world.
Thank you for the screening. That was really, really awesome. There's so much to talk about. I feel like I'm going to have a heart attack. So we'll just start at the beginning. The early colonists may not have been literal vampires, but they did initiate a species transformation, an infection, and invasion on the molecular level. The vampire is kind of a metaphor for the boundary breakdown between people and cultures, but it's also quite literal, and I really enjoy this literalization that the movie does. I was wondering if you could just start us off by talking a bit about how you came upon the figure of the vampire, the undead colonist, and how you think about this kind of colonization through the centuries as a process of infection. And I'm just going to address you to like one person and assume you've done this before in this way.
Yeah. First of all, thank you for having us. And we should acknowledge that Oba, who's like kind of the third part of this one person, couldn't make it. But yeah, it's essentially it's his idea. To answer your question about that,
he's the protagonist of the movie.
He's like
co-creator, executive producer. Yeah.
It's you know, while we were making our last movie, he like had this idea, which is that like, you know, Christopher Columbus is a vampire, bit me himself as like a former slave, and then like kind of he did his bidding for like 500 years, and then like he couldn't kind of like live with the guilt any longer and was able to free himself from the infection. So that's how we came upon the idea, was that it was Oba's idea, and like
yeah. Also, this is just kind of an amazing context to be showing this piece in, and to be in dialogue with both of you and in this place. So thank you for creating that, Elvia.
You're welcome.
The one thing I was going to say is, when Oba presented this idea, the really exciting thing that I had never like fully considered, it's just this idea of like 1492 being the ultimate sci-fi movie. Oh, I shouldn't have said that.
we can share.
The idea of 1492 being the ultimate science fiction movie, where it's like the other half of the planet, or the two halves of the planet join, and thinking about everything in the current state that we're in, kind of birthing from that moment, and then like going through Sylvia Wynter's stuff.
It's you, it's not the microphone.
Yeah.
Sylvia.
We can get into it later.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is this also on? I can just speak loudly.
Do a feedback piece.
Good? Okay. Cool.
Yeah, we will.
Okay, so I want to take seriously the proposition that the human is transforming and is always transforming. You know, we might still be the same species, but there's a lot more plastic in our bodies than there used to be, like a measurable amount of plastic. It's not like there's ever been a purity state to go back to, and I think that that's something that comes up very clearly in this movie, that there is not like a moment of purity at which point we're not infected in some way. But it is also clear to me that at this point in history, we're infected in new ways. I don't want to like lasso in connections like too overtly, but I will. In your incredible and very beloved novel, Something New Under the Sun, which we have here, everyone in drought-ridden California drinks an artificial beverage called water.
That's exactly how you say it.
Okay, good. Water. Unless they can afford real water, which comes from like melting glaciers, which is a very prized commodity. People's bodies are changing in ways I won't disclose in response to this artificial natural beverage. And so reading this book, I couldn't help but it just made me realize the extent to which we're already escaping humanity in a really intense way, and how we're being taken over by our own products, the products of our own activity. So I'm curious what you think about the real kind of like body horror that we're living in, and this movie in some ways is like a play on body horror, but you know, living today is a kind of body horror in that we're being taken over.
Yeah, I love the film, and I loved your book, Elvia. So I'm really happy to be here because I think there are so many connections between these. I think one thing is this idea of porousness, a thing which we fundamentally are. We're open to the world around us, but when we're also invested in individuality and the boundaries of the individual, then it's as though that porousness is a threat, and we have to place it somewhere. So I feel like this sort of vampire trope couldn't exist without this emphasis on being a bounded person with your own goals, wants, the fear of being taken over by someone else's goals, and then sort of the allure of being the individual that takes over others and transforms them into versions of oneself. With my book, I think I was also interested in this porousness. I'm always interested in porousness. But before, if I talked about purity in eating and orthorectic eating, eating right, eating bright, eating light, eating yourself into the version of yourself you want to be, when you talk about water, it becomes much harder to control sort of the intermingling of different substances and things. Like I think about the discovery of the harmful effects of DDT happened in a wetland, I think, with alligators in Florida that were, more quickly affected by the chemical. But we pass things through this medium, and water is a medium that passes and communicates it much more quickly and effectively. So.
Yes, I agree. I mean, the vampire trope doesn't work without the boundary threat, or like the threat of being transgressed or punctured or, invaded. But there's also something erotic about that, because boundaries are erotic and transgression is erotic. And I really love that moment in the movie where they're like locking eyes, and like there's this like deep intimacy happening also, like at the moment of violence. And I think that something that the movie does really beautifully is to kind of bridge this, like, the threat and the violence and the intimacy and the allure of these kind of like super, I guess, like imbalanced power dynamics. Maybe you could talk a bit about power and intimacy and threat.
I'm going to start because I have the mic. I mean, like the kind of. The question behind this movie, I think, there's many, but one of them is like trying to like get to like the root of all evil or something, or like trying to figure out like what went wrong. And like a lot of that is this kind of idea of like this lineage of men who've ruined the world, and this like patriarchal lineage, and this kind of like confusing or blurring these lines between like father and son and lover and brother, and this like kind of like fraternal tenderness or this paternal tenderness, or like at what point does at what point is like a father's physical affection crossing some sort of like taboo line, and like. Because it's actually, like it can be quite unclear and sort of like, and I don't know. Because there was a version of this that was like a lot gayer, actually, and like Oba had us kind of like reel it back a little bit, which like accurately, but like, I don't know. It's like pedophiles like aren't like really horrific, but like pedophiles are like thought of if there's like a there's like an adult man who like has like a fetish for like young boys, like he's thought of as a pedophile first, and like maybe never as a homosexual. And I think there's something interesting there about this this blurry line of touch, and like, but vampires are just like inherently seductive, and like also like wealth is seductive, and like the promise of like immortality is seductive, and like I don't know, this like gray area of like what is rape, really. I don't know.
Yeah, I like what you were saying about fluids also being like the substance where this just becomes really hard to like pin down or talk about.
Yeah, to disentangle one thing from another, or to extract what's been sort of allowed to mingle in the water. I actually wonder if I could ask a question just about that moment where Columbus is on top of the young Oba, and the voice becomes sort of voiceover instead of attached to lips moving, like, and it's so still and haunting. Like, how did that come about?
Well, one of the ideas is also thinking about like how trauma is remembered or re-remembered, and then the evolution of that throughout time, especially when we're talking about historical traumas with multiple peoples, but attaching them to individuals and trying to blur that line or play with that. But I also feel like there's this idea of porousness that was brought up, but also thinking about the vampire trope of the threshold and like being invited in and that kind of complicity as well. And that's also this kind of, just in terms of like the conversations of like decolonizing something in terms of this purity moment, or like trying to get back to something, thinking through that as not something that's that cut and dry, but actually everyone's much more complicit and complicated in.
Or like even just like victim blaming or blaming oneself in moments of like sexual assault or sexual trauma, which I know we keep going back to that, but like I think that was a lot of like this moment of, is like, and then we shot it twice, you know what I mean? We shot it two different ways, because like Oba was like, this has to be like really violent, like he has to like hold him down, he has to be growling, there has to be like, he has to have fangs, it has to be this like monstrous bite, and then like our version was like, make it like more like cooing to like a baby, or like kind of like seductive or like gentle or something, and like, so I ended up just kind of like intercutting both of those, and like what Adam was saying, like you can remember these events differently, or your memory of it evolves and changes.
Yeah, I'd be curious to talk a bit more about this idea of being complicit in your own domination, or finding ways of rejecting complicity even though you might be literally a vampire. I guess just because, thinking about the complexity of power dynamics and the ways, that you might be able to power bottom even if you are in a compromised position, or maybe you've chosen a compromised position. Could you talk about how Oba is complicit or not complicit, also in his different ages?
We're sort of still figuring it out in a way. Like this movie is like an evolution, but like a part of it, like one of the ideas we're riffing with is that he like slowly, there's this idea of like chlorophyll and like photosynthesis. I think Adam thought up like a long time ago, where it's like, it's like vampires are like allergic to sunlight, that maybe like plants are like this antidote or something, and that he like slowly starts chemically altering his situation by like adding more plants to his diet, or like smoking weed like he does, which is like maybe like marijuana is this like kind of vampire antidote taboo or something that is like embodying like all that is good or something. So it's like a slow like willful transition, I guess, but like through photosynthesis and through sunlight. But we're kind of still figuring it out, to be honest. And like to be able to talk about this movie in these contexts is like more, I'm like really down to like for feedback and ideas and criticism and stuff. So like that's why I'm excited about these sort of things. So if you guys have any ideas, or like there's something we missed, please let us know. Yeah.
The other thing I was going to say is this is like the third time we've screened it publicly, and this is one of the, each time we've screened it, either I haven't been there, you haven't been there, or Oba hasn't been there. And that's also like a very weird way to make a movie, or a way to talk about. I mean, I can't speak for him. Also, shameless plug, there's an amazing exhibition at Someday Gallery across the street at 120 Walker, 3R, featuring Oba's sculptures and the film on
very
Loop.
good.
It's a trip. It's up till October 22nd, Wednesday through Saturday, 12 to 6. Sorry. Oba's not here right now, so I just wanted to do that. Anyways, but it is very confusing because we're making this movie together. It's also like his story, and he's like, I need you motherfuckers to make this for me. At one point, there was even a death threat involved. So it's complicated, but it's also like we're making it about him, and then there's like this weird slippage between all of those things, and this kind of like triangular tug of war, but that's also very affectionate and fraternal in a different kind of way also. Like it's familial, or like kind of like this band apparatus where we're each moving towards the same goal, but maybe have different interests in mind. So it's tough to like talk about it authoritatively and say like, this is what this is about, that's what this is about. Especially in that murky territory where we started this conversation off with, ooh, busted.
I mean, I think that makes me want to talk about this idea of protagonists, something you can do when filmmaking, which you can't do when writing a book alone, is have multiple protagonists in the creative process, or also, have a protagonist at two different ages who's related visually in a movie. There's a lot you can do visually that's really hard to do in a book. And something that I like so much about your book and the way that it ends, which I will not spoil, or try not to, is that the sort of individual human protagonist becomes increasingly one with the landscape or with kind of the ecosystem, and in a way that I've rarely seen fiction be able to do. But it's something that I think I've seen more in movies, actually.
Yeah, actually, in the email chains before this event, I think we were all saying that things in Elvia's book sort of uncannily matched things that happened in our own projects. And I think like the death by landscape story that you start your book with, like I hadn't read it when I wrote my book, but then it resonated afterwards. This idea of sort of vanishing and trying to challenge myself to do that in text, to put a character in the foreground and then lose them within the setting that I also made, was one of these, like, I think you should always give yourself a couple impossible challenges when writing a book. So something I wanted to do. The other was to try to capture the feeling of drinking water, which I'm not sure I did. But I think I was really interested in what happens to a book if you pluck out the protagonist. So I think, like, as a spoiler, the anchor of the book sort of perishes at some point within it, but then the book has to keep going on. So where can it go? How would it move when it's not tied to a person? These were things like I wanted to see happen, but I didn't actually know what the answer was. Like, I think for some questions, you can't know what the answer is, and maybe you don't even know afterwards, except by looking at what you've done.
Do you want to read a bit from the end, or?
Yeah. Well, let me read, because really related to this, I think, was setting the challenge for myself sometimes to let the narration wander sort of like a camera through the space without having a person to fixate on. And it was kind of a nerve-wracking process because you really depend on dialogue, human behavior, human goals, I think, to drive a story along. So I had to see what I could do in the meantime. This is just one of the wildfires that's burning all over the city, and they're putting it out with water because it works better for some reason. The entire left side of the mountain is engulfed in flames, the smoke rising straight into the sky like a tower. Far from any major road, the witnesses are small-bodied, furry or scaled, their eyes close to the ground. Their tiny limbs carry them through the underbrush as they look for a hole or hollow, a place to wait out the burning, or an unburned place where the air still slips easily into the lungs. In the midday sky, islands of pale blue are visible beneath the moving, shifting layers of smoke. Where the fire has already passed, the ground is burning. Small licks of flame rise from the blackened earth like birthday candles. An orange color creeps through the black, fading in and out. The low earthbound fire moves like liquid across the terrain, some bright alien liquid climbing hills and tree trunks, flowing upward from the burly base of a coyote bush to hug its slender branches, heating the small, tough, delicately toothed leaves until they bloom with flame. At the highway's periphery, a helicopter passes overhead, dropping a sheet of water on the child-height fence of fire. Where the liquid smothers it, steam rises from the smoldering earth. The vapor resembles a scale model of the sky-sized smoke clouds overhead. It billows and folds and curls over itself. With its frail opalescent blue, it is more beautiful than it should be. If it were ordinary, you would not stop to watch it. But it drifts like a dream on the hot, fire-born wind, a gauzy shadow passing across the unburnt scrub, changing shape from cloud to mist, casting its almost imperceptible blueness on the unburnt oaks. Though the blaze blackens the grasses and trees in chaparral equally, there are still some plants standing oddly unscathed, small clusters of ground-hugging green. Leaved like clover and sprouting tiny pale blue flowers, they resemble other low species creeping at the margins of the hiking trail, and yet they are not any of those species. They have no name and no genus. They stir infinitesimally in the wind. When the flames pass over the small blue flowers, they do not singe. In the clearing smoke, they remain sweetly blue, the color of aquarium gravel. If you plucked one and held it to the flame of a match, it would not catch fire. It would stare back at you unchanged, soft blue against the enveloping heat. It would stare and stare until suddenly the sharp blue edges of its petals began to melt.
So spooky. Yeah, it's wild, that moment when the flower is staring at you, like the whole perspective shifts. I was thinking about when rewatching the movie just now, like those incredibly beautiful landscape shots at the beginning, and this also super effective and dramatic zoom outs that happen, and then also this the circular world that we inhabit, and these all seem like ways of kind of manipulating the relationship between figure and ground. Maybe this is a film noob question, but I'm curious how you think of that relationship when framing shots.
The orb vision was like this joke we had. We wanted to shoot a whole movie that was like circle vision like that. The joke was like, how do you decolonize cinema? You just get rid of the rectangle and just shoot it in a square, because our vision is circular, and at what point, why, optics, the lenses that make that focus the light, the image circle of a lens is already a circle and you're just cropping it out. So it's but it's kind of doesn't really amount to anything and just kind of becomes a gimmick. But it looks like a world. It's like a spyglass, It's the way an explorer sees things, very this kind of focused rifle scope kind of perspective. But then the 360 camera does the opposite, where he's smoking the joint and he's standing on top of the world. So I don't know.
It's a great answer. Yeah, I mean, I guess the square or the rectangle is an invention that happened at a particular time due to a particular technology.
Well, it's obviously paintings were rectangular, but maybe because it was easier to stretch a square canvas. But drums were predate that and were circular. So I'm not really even sure why paintings started to be rectangular, but the film moving through the machine is a series of rectangles, but you could just project it as a circle. I don't know. I actually don't know why we've settled on this rectangular. Do you?
It's also interesting because you cut out a bunch of stuff.
Yeah, you waste. Yeah, you did. That's an image circle. That's a circle, and then you crop in a rectangle on top of it. Yeah. I truly don't know why we watch movies on a square.
Yeah, I got nothing.
Yeah. Does anybody know about other than it's efficient, I guess, for film?
Painting,
I don't know.
definitely painting.
But why? But that's what I'm saying. But it's just trying to replicate a painting. But why we're painting square?
Oh, it's the hang up of Vermeer. He's trying to make camera obscuras in his room, or the people are trying to make lenses in their house, in their homes, and it intersects with this type of painting where people are this is incredibly realistic and amazing. I don't know, and then Yeah, I don't know. But
Motherfuckers.
Well, I also wonder if I wonder if it's like based on architecture, because like early.
Perspective for
Yeah.
geometry.
illusions.
Sounds to like the Greek.
Because well, yeah, but it was like, altarpieces, these commissioned altarpieces were like in the fucking cathedrals, so they were like square and rectangular, and it'd just be like weird to have, but like, I don't know, ship windows were circles, that portal was like a circle, and like that, I don't know.
I guess you also have the dome of the cathedral, which is like a kind of like Oba zoom out moment.
Yeah, and the Greek structure with the light comes through, like that, it doesn't have to be like this, guys.
That's an interesting thing in terms of, what is it? I was going to say foreground, background, but I think there's a better way. Yeah, that's that's pretty juicy. Yeah, I want to get to that point.
Figure ground.
Figuring the ground for the figure, whatever, reversing those things.
What are you talking about?
I'm going to pass the mic.
No, I'm zoning up.
But there's a part at the beginning of your book talking about that.
Yeah, so
Margaret Atwood thing.
Yeah, so the book is named after a Margaret Atwood story called Death by Landscape. I stole it.
When he gets absorbed into
Yeah, so the story, this girl disappears on a hike, and the friend who was with her is convinced that she turned into a tree, not that she disappeared or died. And many years later, this woman who survived has these landscape paintings all over her house. They are rectangles and they are landscape mode. And she thinks that she can sort of like see her friend in these paintings sort of like come back to life. So there's this relationship between the like loss of an individual self, or like the becoming another species, in this case a plant, and this sort of like traditional landscape form. And I guess the idea is, for me, that's interesting, is like, okay, so if you disappear, like as a human, like where is the trace of you left? Like where are you? And like and what is it about the landscape mode that suggests the absence of a figure? Like why is a landscape empty without a person in it? And that's like a really confusing problem for fiction for me. It's like, okay, so if we're thinking of not just a static image, or I guess a moving shot of a landscape, like how does the figure, like how do you tell a story?
But this was really also cool about the excerpt you just read, where it's just like, it's a figure in the landscape looking back, like this POV shift that's just like total wackadoodle in this really bizarre, amazing way.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it's something that doesn't get played with as much, like popping into non-human perspectives, or crawling like a worm through the landscape instead of jumping to the most interesting and relevant thing. But I'm interested in ways in which playing with that can help us move away from the anthropocentricity of our fiction and our narratives. And in a similar way, like I think like you talk in your book about trying to meld a character-centered novel and a systems novel as a way of holding like particularity, but keeping relation and strengthening and breadthening relation. That maybe that's one way to help us sense how we're interconnected instead of feeling so much like a satellite.
Yeah, I guess like I'm calling this like an ecosystems fiction, or like an ecosystems novel or story, where like all of the components, including the human, kind of have an equal importance to the story. And so it's not the human who's trying to make sense of like the vast ecosystem in a like paranoid, frightened way, but the human who is like part of this like moving constellation and influencing it and being influenced by it. Yeah, that's to go back to your question of figure and ground. That's what I was talking about.
Question's generous.
Thank you. I was wondering if we could talk about this, like back to the title of the event, Escape from Humanity, this kind of like fantasy of like returning to, in this case, like a pre-colonial state, or like zooming in on the moment where, as you said, everything went wrong. Is there like a fantasy element in this movie of like not just could we pinpoint it, but like reverse it. Like if we could identify it, we could just like rewind. Like is that like a intrinsic fantasy to this story?
I think it's something we've both talked about and thought about, but maybe not intrinsic to this story. But there's this example of Thomas More and the colony of Morton, busted. And Marymount?
Marymount.
It was like
1625.
Here, you go for it. You got it.
I only.
We should have 2 mics. We got it. You go. You got it.
It was like I only know these facts because I was just like trying to figure out how to fix this into the new version of the script.
I thought you were just gonna end at fix it.
Fix. I was just trying to fix it. It was like Plymouth Plantation, right? Was like there was this other like inverted like queer like we could all get along in some beautiful utopia Plymouth Plantation called Marymount that was just like 20 miles south in the 1620s.
It was a defector from Plymouth.
Yeah.
He was like kicked out.
He was a but they were all getting along. They were partying. They were alcoholics. They were like drinking mead and wine, and like it was like the real Thanksgiving we all celebrate, where it was just like interracial marriage and like open relationships, and it was like one of our friends and mentors, Ed Halter, has written this like amazing thing about it, and it like existed for like 5 years. The first example of the maypole, which is like the on May Day, like the tradition with the pagan kind of thing with the tassels and the pole, was like brought to Marymount in like the 1620s, but the Puritans at Plymouth Plantation were like not down. Yeah, they found out about it, and they went and raided it like, as the legend goes, like some like Monday morning when they were all like too hungover to defend themselves, and they just like burned the place to the ground and arrested Morton and like deported him back to England. But it was like this version of America that like was like this close to maybe existing, that like it didn't have to be that way. I don't know. Sad.
So like there was a utopia that we could
momentarily
rewind back to.
Yeah.
I feel like there have been many, many utopias that existed for micro moments that.
No, totally. But that was just like one of these ones where in this kind of like, I don't know.
I was kind of figuring it out, and then shit really hit the fan.
They were just
the stakes were very high,
happening at the exact same time. Like you could probably hear the hoots and hollers like from Plymouth, and they were just jealous because they weren't having any fun in Plymouth.
But the Puritans, the reason they bugged out is because Morton was giving weapons to the natives, and that was like the final line. But that's also like this idea of like reciprocal relations of like trade and barter and banter, and that was all happening there.
Bummer, I guess.
Yeah.
So also, Nosferatu bite, because we're going to keep making it into a film, and I think the Marymount.
We're trying to work Marymount into the.
Okay. Well, Marymount is a perfect transition to talking about Earthbridge, which is an eco-commune in your book, which is, I find to be like a really like sideways take on this kind of eco-utopia. Like these two characters, a mother and daughter, secede from their lives to go live there, but with no illusions that this is a utopia or that they're going to save the world or that they're going to remedy anything by doing it. And it's a sort of space for mourning the extinction of species. I don't want to put you on the spot, but would you like to read from that as well?
Yeah, I can.
It's a particularly beautiful passage of the book.
If you origin of Earthbridge is? I think I've heard that term before.
Well, it sounds like a typical eco-commune. That's so I think I pulled it out of the typical eco-commune ether, but then it might be something.
Yeah, I don't know. I just feel like this sounds eerily familiar.
I think it's supposed to.
I like a thing in book that sounds like it already exists, but maybe it doesn't. This is Allison, the main character's wife, who's gone to stay here, talking to her husband over the phone and describing this place. It's not a cult, it's a commune, Allison explains with a steady tone. It's called Earthbridge. It's been around for almost 8 years. This place is normal. These people were doctors, teachers, graduate students. I promise you, there's no drugs, or at least no unusual ones. There's yoga in the morning and the evening, but the evening one is a little better. And I have 2 beds in a cabin with a few other women, a couple kids. And the leader? Patrick pressed. You mean the owners? Oh God, I don't know. This woman named Diane and her husband Jeff, they used to work at HBO. They bought this old summer camp a few years ago when Jeff tried to kill himself. He had just watched that viral video of the polar bear that got shot when it tried to scavenge in a grocery store. But I wouldn't say they run this place. What do they make you do? He's pushing now. He feels Allison's carefully chosen words, the swaddle. Patrick, what are you trying to uncover? Just humor me then if it's also wholesome. She sighs, and when she speaks, all the softness of her voice has been compressed into one thin line. Look, we get up at 7, have hot cereal in the dining hall. Then we gather at the lodge, sit on the ground pretzel style. Like children, I know, you don't have to say it. Then someone comes up to the stage, usually Talia or Lyndon, and they give the update. It's a list of losses we've suffered over the last 24 hours, so it's harder to put an exact date and time to their passing. This morning they finally declared the Thwaites Glacier dead. There are pieces floating around still, but it's like looking for teeth in the ashes of a fire. She pauses. And then we mourn. What does that mean, mourning? For a glacier? Patrick can't tell whether what he said sounds serious or mocking. It means what you think it means, Allison replied. We might share our thoughts or feelings. We might cry. We might lie down and feel like dying, feel scared. We might lean or huddle or hug each other. And then someone does the eulogy. They say something like, imagine how this little moth, Philodoria aura magnifica, lived its brief and precious life. Born into the flesh of a single colea leaf, the plant upon which the destiny of its entire species depends. A tiny caterpillar growing each day, eating a minuscule trail through the structure on which it was born, spinning a minuscule cocoon for itself inside tunnels carved in leaf flesh. How impossible it was that a creature like that should ever exist. How impossible it is that it will never come into existence again. How beautiful its life must have been to witness while it was allowed to live. Allison doesn't say anything for a long time, and Patrick doesn't prod her. I know you don't see the point of moths or sitting around weeping, she says crisply. I'm just trying to give you a sense of what goes on.
So beautiful. And sad. I mean, so in my book, there's a bunch of stuff on mystics and how they, like, a lot of the time kind of like escaped from social and political life in order to commune with God more completely, and sort of like in recusing themselves become more deeply politically engaged. So this like the ultimate opting out is the ultimate opting in. And I find something very resonant with the characters at Earthbridge, who are sort of dealing with this tension between like leaving society in order to take responsibility for or deal with the havoc of society. How do you think of that relationship?
Yeah, I feel like Earthbridge is really this Rorschach test. Like, people come up to me and they say, like, I really enjoyed the cult you had in there. Earthbridge sounds like such a lovely place. And I think that it really is, you know, however you feel about these values that Earthbridge displays, you know, that makes your experience of it. For me, it's a lot of ambivalence. I think like feeling very critical about the idea that there is an elsewhere you can escape to, because we are adjacent, we're continuous, we're contiguous. And then also critical of this idea that our vision of an escape is still something sort of based on the vision that we recognize from the 60s, I think. So it's not a new method, it's a familiar method. And, you know, what I like sort of about the idea in Nosferatu that this person was a vampire and are no longer a vampire, I feel like I haven't heard that story told, and it's kind of the question of decolonization. how would it happen? What methods would allow it to happen? We don't know. But if we posit that it can happen, we're asking the question of like, would this do it? Would this like bridge the narrative? And so I think that Allison is not doing that. Allison is going methods first and trying something, but it doesn't mean that there aren't characters in the book, like her daughter, who are actively feeling dissatisfaction with the solution and thinking of something else that could happen.
Yeah. I think ambivalence is definitely what I got from Earthbridge, but I also got this like real emphasis on collective grief and mourning as a practice that is relevant it's relevant to dealing with extinction. I also was thinking about sort of like the complex relationship between guilt and grief, and in Nosferatu, I think that's a relationship that comes up a little bit, and also in some of your other work, like going back to the idea of being complicit in your own domination, or also mourning for a lost past, or mourning for a moment at which things could have gone differently. Maybe you could talk about grief and or guilt in the story.
I'm still thinking about the 1960s escape pod that fails. Because also, I think it's interesting in terms of thinking about like indigenous liberation movements that are also like deeply tied to that moment at the same time, and that kind of like spaceship that doesn't take off, or what could also be read as like red supremacism in a different light. I think maybe one of the things we were struggling with and trying to figure out is like everyone's complicity in this process, and trying to like struggle through that tangled web to figure out some way forward, or like a way where like guilt, shame, frustration, and grief could be repurposed for new ends, which is like a very progressivist way of thinking about it, which has its own loaded baggage, but is maybe like nihilistically optimistic at the same time, or also grasping for straws. I don't know. That's where I'm at right now.
I think like dance and music are really important to this question of grief specifically, and mourning, and the end of the movie is like, I don't know, tried to really focus on the music, and like I've had like some really, really amazing times like dancing and with people who I really had no business like ever being in that close proximity with, or not business, but just like, these kind of connections or these intimate moments that you would just like really never find, but they are genuine and they're nonverbal, but they are like, it's kind of all out there, but also none of it fucking matters, because like music is so fucking sick, and like dancing to music is so fucking sick that like these, and we were like, it's like, I don't know, I think for all of us making this movie, including like Village Drums of Freedom, the drum group who's featured at the end, like it's less about like Rasta theology and more about this kind of like thing that Jerry, who is like the leader of this group, who died while we were filming, would always say. He would say rhythm is life, and this kind of like, I know I'm getting like really like kind of corny here, but like I think there is something to that, in this way that like actual political practice or like escapism, or I mean dance is like escapism, but I've like at these at that but like in mourning and grounding memorial services and funerary services, like when you're able to like kind of just like listen to music and dance, it's really, I don't know, there's something there, and you can kind of spend time with people that you normally wouldn't in a different way.
Yeah, it's a particular kind of collective experience where other kinds of differences, I guess, are suspended.
Yeah. And I know maybe that's dodging the question, but I also think that like the end of the movie should be remembered as a moment of music and dance.
I think I remember it that way. Yeah, that sounds right to me. Something that they're doing at Earthbridge is kind of like this intense collective living experience, and sort of, I guess the goal is to de-individualize in some way. Is that right?
Yeah, divest from individuality, maybe a little. But I think the question comes up, I'm using this term a lot since I read your book, but is it something outside of capitalism at all, or is it outside of capitalism LARPing? And I think on this chapter in your book where you talk about creating a LARP of your first novel and playing out scenarios within it and what you found from doing that, would you describe that a little bit to people?
Sure, thanks. That's the last essay in the book. I wrote a novel. I was invited to do a residency. I decided to make a live-action role play out of the novel with a friend of mine. We distributed the characters, we made the scenarios, and we let the characters improvise.
You LARPed Oval?
Yes.
Whoa.
Yeah. And and at the end of the LARP, the same thing happens at the end of the book, sort of.
Burns down.
Yeah, well, sort of. No, but in the human relationships, nothing burns down in the LARP, but in the book, everything burns down. There was this insane moment in the LARP where the characters okay, I'm gonna be really efficient. In a role play, you often have game masters who are not participating in the LARP but are facilitating the game. And I was being a game master and also sort of bartending a party in the game. And the characters decided to drug me with a drug that I had invented, which was extremely upsetting to me and also very exciting because it broke the fourth wall of the game and kind of ruined the illusion that I had of being the author of this scenario. And the whole point of this had been to distribute authorship amongst a group of people and to see what happens when a narrative is collaboratively made, as close as I would ever get to making a movie. It's running a role play. And this kind of collaborative authorship ultimately took me over as the individual author and made my role obsolete, which I thought was really, just kind of an incredible proof of concept, I guess, that you can take a story and allow other people to run with it and still end up with a compelling narrative. I mean, I guess that's what was also kind of important to me about the experience.
Yeah, that even if it is sort of a place scenario, there are things that you can take out of it back to your practice, to the rest of the world. And I think it's, if there's something really wrong with Earthbridge, it's that people sequester themselves there and are not sort of returning to the world and trying to be in it, having committed to living differently or imagined a way they could live differently.
Yeah, there is that kind of magic circle drawn around, to use a LARP term, the magic circle drawn around this eco-commune where there is a false boundary maybe being made. And that is again, a site where porosity is denied, I guess. How are we doing on time?
7:35.
Okay.
Do you want to open it up?
Yeah, unless you guys want to add something to what Alex just said.
Have you seen Psychosymbiotaxiplasm?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Good point. Yeah. Yeah, it's been a while.
Let's read that later.
Yeah, we'll do a call.
Bring it up right now.
Yeah.
Should we ask other people to ask?
Have you seen what? Have you seen what?
Psychosymbiotaxiplasm. It's this awesome. It's sorry, thank you. Symbiosychotaxiplasm. It's this kind of documentary where the crew of or it's not, I don't know, the crew takes control or something. William Greaves, and they shot in Central Park, and it's sounds like your LARPing experience, where I don't know. You should just check it out. It's amazing. Reversal of roles.
More extreme than.
Do you mind if I grab this mic and then we can give you another mic back? Does anyone have a question?
I feel like this is maybe mostly for Adam and Bayley, but I think it is for everyone. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about humor in your work. I think it's interesting. I mean, these are some really dark topics that you're all dealing with, and I think it's interesting that there is a line of humor through the work that we've seen today. And I guess that's it. So talk about humor.
Never heard of them.
Do it in a fun way.
A little bit of sugar helps the medicine go down. And I've been thinking about this a lot recently. Me and my brother are working on a different project about repatriation of ancestors and Native American human remains. Anyways, whatever. We got to hang out with Phil Deloria, who's Vine Deloria's son, and Vine Deloria Jr. wrote this really amazing essay called On Indian Humor, where it's like the only way to like unpack or directly address and confront super traumatic history is by starting off by cracking a joke. And this idea of like a serious joke, or this idea of like unsettling an audience, is really important, and I feel like compelling in order to broach these topics without being self-serious or congratulatory or this false pretense of creating empathy, when like the fallacy of empathy, this idea of like, why would I have to put myself in someone else's shoes? Why couldn't I actually just think about what they're saying and respond to it in that way? And also, I feel like the work of Anti-Banality Union does that kind of exceptionally well, talking about existential concerns in this kind of way where you lead with humor in order to laugh and cry all at the same time, or the slippage between those two things.
And for people who aren't familiar with the New Red Order, it's also stories.
Never heard of them.
Yeah.
Just kidding. New Red Order is great. Also, yeah, sign up for New Red Order.
All I see is your hat.
Triple Canopy was a big proponent of getting NRO off the ground. You can sign up by going to newredorder.org or calling toll-free 1-888-NEW-RED-1. It sounds like a joke. It's not. That's all I got. There's so much humor in both the things you all are doing, too. That would be
I would like to hear what you have to say about that, because your book is hilarious. It's like a crazy lampoon on Hollywood culture also at the beginning, and like advertising and this kind of like corporate conspiracy. Like there's this whole sort of like parodic take on corporate conspiracy that I find really compelling.
Yeah, I mean, I feel a lot of what Adam said, the sugar and the medicine, like I think of it as, most pills don't taste like pills. They taste like the coating of the pill, which is something else. But also, I think as a thing that you need to build in to keep yourself writing a project and not getting weighed down too much or depressed too much by what you're writing about. Like, the jokes are cracked in the book. Maybe they're cracked with the reader, but they're first cracked with myself so that I can keep going.
That seems very relatable to me. I feel the same. I think also like the humor allows you to poke a hole in the kind of like extreme guilt or sadness that might stop you from even being able to engage or read further or watch further. Like it just creates like a little perforation that you can even see through, so you can even start, I think. Like it's kind of like a premise for me for engagement a lot of the time.
I was wondering if, for the film, if it was some of the ideas in it reminded me of Frank B. Wilderson, who is a scholar who critiques humanism from a black perspective on using Afro-pessimism and things like that. I don't know if that informed the film or not, but I was just curious.
The question of Afro-pessimism and Wilderson's writing, which is phenomenal and amazing, but also like something I've been struggling with like really intensely, is this kind of like anti-blackness within indigenous communities and the kind of indigenous erasure of some kinds of Afro-pessimistic viewpoints. And for me, working on this project is kind of a collision course to try to figure out or resolve those things. And I'm not sure if we're doing that. I'm not sure how we're doing that. It's a very funky road to walk.
Does anyone do you want to summarize Afro-pessimism?
I would prefer not to. Do you want to do it?
I'm looking for someone to explain it to me. No, let's just assume everyone's familiar.
Well, yeah, I mean,
Sorry, I forgot.
No, Wilderson's writing is also like super accessible and approachable and amazing, and like talks about something that's super real in the world, where it's just like, ooh, oh man.
I mean, I I found this like Black Anarchist zine like 2 days ago that like cited Calvin Warren, who I hadn't read before, but it was kind of it was this idea that like anarchism isn't accessible to like radical Black politics, and it's this like this denial of humanism and this kind of like thing where like I'm gonna read a quote because I brought it just now, and it's better. It's like as long as the book was called Ontological Terror, and he's saying as long as we as Black people, as long as we continue to invest in the value structure that renders the human the highest, most important being in the world, we will continue to plead for recognition and acceptance. Either we will continue this degrading quest for human rights and incorporation, or we'll take a leap of faith and reject the terms through which we organize our existence. And like it's this idea of like human rights and like who is even considered human in I don't know, that context. And I don't know, I just stumbled across this yesterday. I gave the zine away. I should have actually just brought it, but it felt extremely relevant to this. So
the thing I'm struggling with is this idea of exceptionalism, and in all the ways that it manifests. And that's also like, especially in the context of what is escaping humanity. You know what I mean? I just like hope for this moment where we can all talk about these things together without having it be like so difficult, because there's certain conversations that have happened in public and there's certain conversations that have happened behind closed doors. And I think this film is an aspiration to combine those things, but I'm also concerned and unsure if actually this is like the appropriate moment to do that, if that makes sense. No.
By appropriate moment, you mean like historically?
Not historically, but maybe like right now in this context, in this audience. You know what I mean?
I mean, yeah, again, like Oba isn't here, and like this is, I don't know, and a largely like non-Black audience, and I think I don't want to be speaking for anybody, I don't want to be speaking for other people's experience.
It's also like this idea of having this conversation take place in front of other people. And there's also like an exceptionalism to that too, that I also want to skirt around. Yeah.
It's a good question. It's at the core of the movie. It's a very, very difficult and confusing movie. And I think the only way I see us figuring our way through this movie specifically is just like this kind of continued dialogue and discourse, and also going slowly and collaborating and like not claiming we like have like the answer, and just like pushing forward in the way that most movies are made. So thank you for the question.
Hi, I was wondering in the film if you could explain some of the choices of like feminizing Columbus in his like costuming. He had like a parasol and a bonnet, and I was just wondering like what the reasoning and kind of making that choice was.
Yeah, our character references for Columbus were actually more of like baby, like we had like a lot of like more infantilizing him rather than feminizing him, and I think that's interesting that came off that way. But we were also trying to steer a little clear of like kind of the trope of like the supervillain basically just being closeted, and like the reason for like that sort of like vicious lashing out at like societal norms is that like this like inability to like express their actual sexuality. We were trying to steer away from that, and so it was a fine line. But again, sort of these early questions about this kind of like patriarchal touch and like these kind of like ambiguously like rapey or like pedophilic intimacies without it like becoming like gay man equals like supervillain. But it's, I don't know. We actually didn't really think that much about feminizing him as much as like making him kind of be like this kind of like disabled like baby or something.
Close this out with a cruel question from an editor. One of the things that Alex and I have been talking about a lot in regards to this issue, and which got brought up frequently, between many different points in this conversation was about this idea of, what does it actually mean to envision oneself from, or envision a narrative from a perspective that is a non-human perspective. And the kind of loops that we end up getting caught in this conversation is, we're always from thinking about this from a human perspective, or, there's no way to escape the lens of our own humanity, to nod to the title. So this is not to ask you to do our work for us, but wondering if, how do you think about that? How do you think about that when we're trying to, envision from the perspective of, say, a tiny blue flower being burned and looking out at, the apocalypse or something, or from a landscape, or trying to recede into the landscape, that we're always projecting our own experience of the landscape or our idea of what that flower is onto it. And how do you grapple with that? And is there work that you've experienced that does that in an interesting way?
I guess I would just start by saying there is no escape. I have no illusions of escape. Escape is a fantasy. Escape is a privilege. The only people who will be able to escape from the mess are, Bezos. Nobody else is getting off the planet. So I'm more interested in dealing with that fantasy as a negative space to push up against, or to outline the shape of that fantasy so I can see the shape of the world that I'm in.
Yeah, and I think that, it would be nice if there were a typological distinction, but to talk about escaping from humanity, the concept or category or way of thinking is not necessarily the same thing as wishing not to be human. Could we be human without living within the sort of delimitation of that concept quite as much? As human beings, there's no reason why we need to write human-centered, individual-focused stories that remain within a small group of human characters or whatever. There are so many places to go that we can project, but projection isn't solely, I think, an imposition. It's also an act of reaching out. It's trying to relate to what something else might experience, and then perhaps that gets refined and adjusted over time.
I literally just was there's such a rich cinema history of non-human films. It's Babe 2, Babe Big in the City, Milo and Otis, Old Yeller, it's all of these animal movies. I was wait, what the fuck? There's so many.
Well, maybe to counter that, I feel as honoring a kind of cultural heritage that I have, who's just entered into the realm of humanity, I don't know if I'm that interested in the non-human perspective. Yeah. Busted.
Good. Shall we end there?
Good enough. Yeah.